Well, James Madison, we finally meet in this wonderful debate that I've been waiting for all my career. Trying to understand the Madisonian model, trying to see what exactly it does for the rest of the world. Oh, hey, sorry about that. I was figuring that I could get into this little debate with James Madison, one of the key founders, key parts of the story of constitutionalism. Well, anyways, let me get back. What I want to talk today about is the Madisonian model. The Madisonian model really is a gift, almost America's gift to the story of constitutionalism. Right? You can't understand the Constitution without understanding what James Madison was trying to do and what James Madison was trying to say. So, really what I love about James Madison is he comes to the convention knowing that we were going to tear up the Articles of Confederation. He comes to the convention knowing that we've got to have something to start with. And so when he gets to the convention, he says, hey, now that we tore everything up, like, we've got to start somewhere. I just so happen to have written down some ideas. Why don't we start with that? And when you look at it, it's got all kinds of ideas, and it's essentially 78% of what we end up having in the Constitution itself. So we can't understand, like I said, the American constitutional framework unless and until we understand Madisonian model. So let's talk just a little bit about it, right? His big thing was to prevent the tyranny of the majority. We've talked about this. The tyranny of the majority could be a pretty scary thing, because what happens when 50.1% of the population overrules the 49.9%? Or what happens when that majority really violates the rights of other people? Well, he says the way we can limit the tyranny of the majority from ever happening is limit majority control, put some frameworks in place so that majorities don't always have the control, separate the powers among branches of government. There's Baron Montesquieu for you. Checks and balances to make sure that everybody's doing what they're supposed to do and they're following the rules. And here's the gift: establishing a federal system. That's a uniquely American trait, this federal system and federalism, which we'll dive into here in a minute. Okay, so this Madisonian model, what we're really talking about here is trying to separate the people from the direct governing, right? We know direct democracy is not going to work. We got millions of people in this country. So how do we do this? Well, we set up three branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And that legislative branch, see, originally the voters only elected the House of Representatives. That was the only place where we had a real representative democracy. See, the Senate was elected by the state legislatures, which was elected by the people, so it was like twice removed representative democracy. And then the president, well, same kind of thing. We voted for the Electoral College, and then the Electoral College elects the president. And so we also didn't want to get the judiciary involved with the democratic process because, well, tyranny of the majority, and the judiciary is there to protect the fundamental law. So the president and the Senate, both groups that are not directly elected by the people, are the ones who have control over the judiciary. So when you really look at it, there's only one place in our original system where the people have a direct say, and that's at the House of Representatives. Side note, that becomes really important when we talk about power of the purse. Keep that in mind. So, when we look at the Madisonian model, we have to ask, well, whom then does each branch represent? In the Madisonian model, the presidency represented the elite. See, those are the people that maybe have a vested interest in the economy and have a vested interest in the way the government's going to work, so their voice is heard through the presidency. See, the aristocrats, the smart ones, the people that kind of knew the fundamental law, they were the ones that were represented by the judiciary. The states, since the state legislatures were the ones that picked the Senate, they're represented in the Senate. And of course, the people. The people are represented in the House of Representatives. Notice, again, the people only occur in one of those four places. Why? Because Madison and the framers were afraid of what the people would say. Remember tyranny of the majority? the key question, where is our democracy in this model, right? What is it based on? That's something that we really need to get over, because it's a bit of a hurdle that we have to try and overcome. We'll talk about this a whole lot more, but one of the other pieces of the Madisonian model is the idea of checks and balances. We go again back to Baron de Montesquieu, and the checks and balances system says, well, the executive branch can't act alone. They have to follow the law, and the judicial branch interprets that law and interprets it to say whether or not the president has actually done what he or she is supposed to do. The legislative branch can't work alone. They have to work with the executive branch. And here's the thing, when the legislative branch does something the president doesn't like, the president can veto that. When the president does something that the courts say is outside the boundaries of the Constitution, well, the courts can deem that unconstitutional. But the president also has power over the courts because the president gets to nominate judges to the federal bench. These things all go back and forth, and they all tie together. And we'll look at more of those when we look at the institutions of government. Well, so once we have the Constitution written, now we got to look at how we're going to ratify this thing, because they passed it at the Constitutional Convention, but 9 of 13 states had to actually ratify this to become law. So we get two camps that really start to fight against each other. The Federalists, who love the Constitution, they love the fact that this gives them more power and gives the central government more power than we had under the Articles. They're supported by large landowners, the merchants, the professionals, right? They wanted weaker state governments, a stronger national government, indirect election of the officials because they were afraid of the people, and they wanted a government by the elite, right? That was their key thing. Whereas the anti-federalists are saying, wait a second, this government might get too powerful and take our rights away. There's a strong state government is what we need, not a national government. We want direct election of people. We want shorter terms, ruled by the common man, not the elite. So now we got these two camps that are setting up. By the way, don't confuse these two with the Republican Party of today and the Democratic Party of today. You can't really make the distinction as to where they kind of relate. Things change as we look at parties. In the ratification fight, the Federalists were making an argument through the media of the day, letters to the editor. The Federalist Papers were 85 articles that were written by 3 really important guys, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. And they signed it under the pen name Publius because they were defending the Constitution. They had to get people in the state of New York convinced that this was a really good idea. One of the only ways they could get people to ratify it and convince them that this was a good idea was to answer one of the anti-federalist claims, and that was that people's rights needed to be protected overtly, on paper, in writing. And so the Federalists said, well, all right, you're calling for a Bill of Rights because you're afraid this big bad government's going to take over your rights? Fine. We'll list them out. We're not going to list everything because we're going to get something missed at some point, but we'll give you some so that we have an idea of what rights can be protected, right? The anti-federalist concern was assuaged, and this battle between the Federalists and anti-federalists kind of dies off pretty quickly. So we did it, right? 9 of 13 states ratified it. We had majority support, but they were ratified by state conventions, not by state legislatures. Well, so the number worked, but the number of people, not so much. See, the other thing that was important was had to wait for New York and Virginia to approve it. Why New York and Virginia? 2 biggest states. They got to approve it if this thing's going to have any legitimacy. But New Hampshire's was the 9th state to ratify it, and that made the Constitution official 6 months later, once it was ratified. So 1787, we passed it out of convention. By 1789, it's the law of the land, and we've successfully replaced the Articles of Confederation. Okay, quick summary, right? So the Constitution ratified, as it was ratified, strengthens the power of the national government. This is where it was different than the Articles of Confederation. It protects individual rights, which is what the Anti-Federalists wanted, with a Bill of Rights, and it gives us an opportunity to formally and informally change the Constitution and shape that Madisonian system of government. But more on that later. See, the Madisonian system really was about federalism, and federalism is that sharing of power between state and national government. That was one of the big compromises. The anti-federalists wanted states to have power, and the federalists wanted to have the national government to have power. So how do we do this? Well, we split it up. We share power. We say, states, you can do some things. Federal government, you can do others. Other things, you're going to share. So we got to look at this idea of sharing, and we got to figure out whether or not it's actually true. So here's some things we're going to define: dual federalism, cooperative federalism, coercive federalism, and this new thing called devolution. When we look at dual federalism, that's the idea that national government power is limited. It's limited to listed things as found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It says national and state governments are sovereign in their own spheres. So national government has certain powers as listed, and state governments have other powers that aren't listed in the Constitution and are reserved to the states. So this is characterized by tension. States want their thing, federal government wants their thing, and they're not going to cooperate because they don't want to give it up. What do we look at that as? It's called layer cake federalism. And when we look at layer cake federalism, what we're looking at is a distinction between federal, state, and local powers. When we look at cooperative federalism, it's kind of the opposite. There's an overlap of power. The functions require cooperation. They share power, and there's a lot of places for people to influence the public policy process. We call those policy entrepreneurs. We look at that and we call that marble cake federalism. It's kind of hard to distinguish where those things kind of overlap and where the dark chocolate and the vanilla cake kind of start blending together. The cooperative federalism metaphor, again, is